Would you stay silent if a fallen hero was disrespected? Or would you rise to defend their honor? On one unforgettable flight, Barron Trump made a choice that left everyone speechless. The boarding process for Flight 729 to Washington, D.C. was already in motion, passengers shuffling down the aisle, stowing their bags, and adjusting their seats. Amid the usual hum of pre-flight chatter, the cabin crew paused. Outside the small windows, a black hearse had pulled up alongside the plane. On the tarmac, an honor guard solemnly unfolded an American flag, draping it over a casket. Inside the aircraft, a silence hung for a moment as a few passengers noticed what was happening. A crew member quietly explained over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a short delay while we honor a fallen soldier being transported to their final resting place in Washington, D.C." The gravity of the moment wasn't lost on most, but not everyone shared the sentiment. A man in a sharply pressed suit scoffed audibly, muttering, "This is ridiculous. We've got schedules to keep." A younger woman seated nearby chimed in, "Why couldn't they do this after we left? Some of us have places to be." Their voices cut through the stillness like a blade, drawing uneasy glances from other passengers. Whispers began to ripple across the rows. Some looked visibly uncomfortable, others exchanged disapproving looks. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, shielding her ears from the harshness of the remarks. The honor guard stood at attention, their movements deliberate and respectful as they carried the casket up the loading ramp. But inside the cabin, tension simmered. But little did anyone know a young man in the back row was about to step into the moment and shift the narrative entirely. The plane's interior felt unusually tense. Overhead bins clicked shut and seatbelts snapped into place as flight attendants moved briskly, trying to keep the process running smoothly. Outside, the honor guard reached the aircraft door, carefully carrying the flag-draped casket into the cargo hold. Seated near the middle of the cabin, the man in the suit leaned back with a dramatic sigh. "This is taking forever," he grumbled, loud enough for those around him to hear. His impatience seemed to fuel others. A woman 2 rows behind him whispered, "What's the big deal? It's not like the soldier knows we're waiting." A ripple of uncomfortable reactions spread across the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some looking down at their phones as if to escape the moment. An elderly woman near the window dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering softly to the man beside her, "That could have been my grandson." In the back row, a tall young man sat quietly, his presence mostly unnoticed until now. His name was Barron, and though his face might have been familiar to a few, he hadn't drawn attention to himself. Dressed simply in a dark jacket, he leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. He wasn't with the main group of passengers when they boarded. He had entered discreetly with a security detail, taking the rearmost seat away from the crowd. He wasn't looking at his phone or fiddling with his belongings like so many others. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the window, where the honor guard completed their task with the solemnity and care it deserved. But the murmurs of impatience were growing louder, and Barron knew this moment demanded more than silence. The murmurs intensified and the tension in the cabin became palpable. A man seated a few rows ahead stood up, turning to address a flight attendant. "Look, I'm sorry, but I've got a connection to make. How much longer is this going to take?" His tone wasn't just impatient. It bordered on disdain. The flight attendant, her professionalism unwavering, responded gently, "Sir, this process should only take a few more minutes. We appreciate your patience as we honor a fallen service member." Her words didn't seem to land. The man scoffed and sat back down, muttering under his breath. A few passengers around him smirked in agreement, exchanging knowing glances as if the delay was some sort of personal affront. The woman from earlier chimed in again, her voice sharp. "This is why airlines are a mess. They cater to these over-the-top gestures instead of sticking to schedules." It was as if the act of disrespect fed on itself, emboldening those who shared the sentiment. The cabin, once filled with a solemn stillness, now buzzed with low-level discontent. A veteran seated near the front of the plane stiffened in his seat, his jaw tightening, but he remained silent. The elderly woman by the window clutched her tissue tighter, shaking her head. Barron continued to watch from the back. He glanced toward his security detail seated a few rows ahead. They appeared neutral, their faces unreadable, but Barron's expression darkened. His gaze swept over the disgruntled passengers, the honor guard's movements still reflected faintly in the window beside him. But as the final murmurs of disrespect echoed through the cabin, Barron made a decision that would change the atmosphere entirely. The aircraft had grown restless, the murmurs of discontent weaving through the rows. But in the back of the plane, Barron Trump leaned forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the seat in front of him. His presence, which had been almost invisible until now, began to shift. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate but calm. The sudden rise of his 6-foot-plus frame caught the attention of a nearby passenger who turned to look. The recognition spread quickly. Whispers of, "Is that Barron Trump?" rippled through the cabin, blending with the undercurrent of impatience. Barron cleared his throat, not loudly but just enough to cut through the noise. His voice, steady and firm, carried a weight that immediately drew attention. "Excuse me," he began, his tone calm but commanding. "I'd like to say something." The murmurs ceased almost instantly. Heads turned, and the passengers who had been vocal about their displeasure shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the man in the suit who had been the most vocal looked over his shoulder, his expression wary. "I understand everyone's in a hurry," Barron continued, his hands resting on the back of the seat in front of him. "But that casket down there belongs to someone who made the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Someone who gave up their schedule, their future, their life, so the rest of us could have the freedoms we enjoy." His words hung in the air, each syllable precise, each pause intentional. The plane had gone completely silent, save for the faint hum of the engines. But Barron wasn't done. He had something more to say, something that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. Barron's gaze swept across the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers one by one. "You don't have to know their name or their story," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What matters is the respect they deserve, not just for their sacrifice, but for the countless sacrifices made by so many others like them." His words carried a weight that silenced even the most impatient passengers. The man in the suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat, no longer able to meet Barron's eyes. The young woman who had spoken earlier glanced down at her hands, avoiding the stares of those around her. Barron continued, his tone softening but losing none of its conviction. "I think we can all spare a few minutes to honor someone who can no longer speak for themselves. They've given far more than any of us will in these few moments of waiting." The cabin crew exchanged glances, visibly moved. Even the veteran near the front of the plane, who had remained silent until now, turned slightly in his seat, his expression softening. And then, in an unexpected gesture, Barron did something that no one had anticipated. He reached into his carry-on bag, pulling out a small American flag. Holding it carefully, he walked to the middle of the aisle and placed it on the empty seat nearest to the window, directly above where the casket rested below. "This seat belongs to them," he said simply, stepping back. His words carried an almost sacred finality, and the simplicity of the act spoke louder than anything else. But what happened next wasn't something Barron, or anyone else, could have predicted. The plane seemed to hold its breath. Barron's gesture reverberated through the cabin, leaving no room for further complaints. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The flag resting on the empty seat became a poignant symbol, visible to all and impossible to ignore. The veteran near the front stood up, his movements slow but purposeful. "Son," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for reminding us what's important." He gave Barron a respectful nod before placing his hand over his heart. Others began to follow, standing or sitting straighter, their hands mimicking the veteran's gesture. The man in the suit who had been so vocal earlier looked around at the sea of solemn faces. His bravado seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. I didn't mean to be disrespectful," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The young woman beside him turned red, her earlier annoyance replaced with visible guilt. But it wasn't just shame that filled the cabin. Something deeper was happening. A teenage boy in a hoodie, who had been quietly watching from a window seat, removed his earbuds and muttered, That's cool." His voice filled with newfound respect. A mother whispered something to her child, who looked at Barron with wide, curious eyes. The cabin crew, touched by the unfolding scene, moved with reverence as they finalized preparations for takeoff. A flight attendant walked over to Barron, her voice soft as she said, "Thank you for doing that. It means more than you know." But as the plane began to taxi down the runway, another ripple of emotion swept through the passengers, cementing this moment in their hearts forever. As the plane taxied toward the runway, a hushed reverence filled the cabin. Passengers sat in reflective silence, their earlier impatience replaced with quiet introspection. Outside the window, the honor guard saluted as the aircraft began to move, their figures standing resolutely against the backdrop of the setting sun. Mid-flight, the pilot made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your patience earlier. We're carrying the remains of a fallen soldier today, and it's a solemn honor to have them aboard. Let us take a moment of silence to reflect and pay our respects." The entire cabin obeyed without hesitation. Heads bowed, hands folded, eyes closed. It was as if everyone aboard felt the weight of the moment in their own way. The man in the suit, who had earlier voiced his annoyance, clasped his hands together, his expression somber. The young woman who had joined in his complaints wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Barron remained in his seat at the back, his focus unwavering. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. His intention had always been simple: to remind everyone of the value of respect and sacrifice. His security detail exchanged a subtle glance, acknowledging the young man's composure with quiet pride. When the plane landed in Washington, D.C., the passengers remained seated as the crew requested. No one rushed to disembark. Instead, they watched as the honor guard retrieved the casket, standing tall as they carried it from the aircraft. A ripple of applause began, soft at first, then swelling into something powerful and unified. Barron didn't clap. He placed his hand over his heart instead, a small but meaningful gesture that resonated deeply. But as the passengers exited the plane, many carried something far greater than their luggage, a renewed sense of what it means to honor and remember. As passengers filed out of the plane, the mood was strikingly different from when they had boarded. The earlier impatience and frustration were gone, replaced by an air of quiet thoughtfulness. Some exchanged soft words with the cabin crew, others nodded to Barron as they passed, their expressions filled with gratitude and respect. The man in the suit paused briefly near the exit. Turning back to Barron, he hesitated, then said, "You were right. I needed that reminder." Barron simply nodded, his face calm but firm. The young woman followed shortly after, whispering a heartfelt, "Thank you." Outside on the tarmac, the honor guard loaded the casket into a waiting hearse as a small group of onlookers saluted. Among them stood the soldier's grieving family, their faces etched with pain but also pride. The passengers, many of whom had been strangers to one another just hours earlier, lingered at the airport windows, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, they weren't businessmen, tourists, or weary travelers. They were witnesses to a collective reminder of sacrifice and unity. As Barron quietly left the terminal with his security detail, he glanced back once, taking in the sight of people standing shoulder to shoulder, moved by the power of one small act. This isn't just a story about a fallen soldier. It's a story about the importance of respect. Respect for those who give everything, and respect for the moments that demand our attention, no matter how inconvenient they may seem. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on the sacrifices of others. Let's carry forward the lessons of humility and gratitude, one small gesture at a time. And don't forget to share this message. It's one the world needs to hear. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and remind us of what truly matters.